So far, you may have noticed something of a theme emerging in the artists we have talked about on this channel. It would seem, from what we have covered, that pretty much all important art was made by French lads in the 19th century. Well, this may shock you, but it seems people in places other than 19th century France made art as well. Some of these places would play a key role in the development of what we now call modern art. One of these places was a country that nowadays produces a huge amount of art of various kinds, Japan. The Japanese have a long art history all their own. Japanese ceramics, painting and theatre have histories stretching back centuries, and modern-day Japan seems to be having an impact on global culture which is comparable to the Marshall Plan. As such, it should probably come as no surprise that Japanese artists contributed greatly to the creation of modern art. Van Gogh, Manet, Degas all expressed admiration for Japanese art. Its bright colours, flowing lines and flat perspective would influence their works and others. One of the most popular Japanese artists among the new European audiences of that time was the great painter and printmaker Katsushika Hokusai, who was born in 1760 in what is now Tokyo and was particularly well placed for a career in the arts. His father, or possibly uncle, sources differ, was a mirror maker who served the wealthy classes, including the emperor himself. From a young age, Hokusai was apprenticed in this craft, learning to paint from working on decorative frames for mirrors. Later, as a teenager, Hokusai would become apprenticed to an engraver and begin to make his own illustrations. He studied under the master printmaker Katsukawa Shunsho and eventually began making a living creating paintings and prints of his own in the then popular Japanese style Ukiyo-e. Ukiyo-e, or floating world prints, depicted scenes of Japanese life, folklore, countryside, geisha and sumo wrestlers, as well as more adult scenes, referred to euphemistically as pictures of spring. The images were inspired by the somewhat hedonistic lifestyle that was enjoyed by the citizens of Edo in the 17th and 18th centuries, when the city served as a court for the ruling emperor and attracted nobles and soldiers from all over Japan. The entertainments, courtesans, pleasure houses, and increased trade created an environment of bohemian revelry that must have seemed somewhat ephemeral compared to the more traditionally rigid Japanese social structures. Hence the origin of the term floating world. Ukiyo-e was pretty different in several ways from Western art, including the perspective, the colour, and the use of shapes. The bright colours of ukiyo-e prints were vibrant compared to the endless range of subtle greys that were favoured by Western painters. The way shapes and forms were handled differed too. Rather than the perfect structured drawings that were the foundations of Western art, the Japanese utilised a flowing descriptive line which favoured emotive shape over realistic form. Ukiyo-e also used a different system of perspective. Whereas Western artists used parallel lines aligned to a vanishing point to create depth, the Japanese style favoured Chinese methods, which instead of using a vanishing point would arrange parallel lines in the background to create a sense of space without making everything conform to one point. Another ukiyo-e perspective technique often used was to arrange a picture in layers, placing large shapes in the foreground, smaller ones in the middle, and even smaller ones again in the background. Often, these would be arranged with smaller and further away forms being higher up on the page, which can account for the often present bird's eye view effect that so much of Japanese and Chinese art exhibits. Ukiyo-e images were widely distributed within Japanese borders by printing houses which catered to the demand for them. These printing houses would form a distribution network and also an early form of copyright. The house that owned the plate had the right to make as many copies of the image as they wanted to, and houses would trade and sell plates and thus copyrights constantly. In addition to this, ukiyo-e printing formalized a business model where artists would sell their work to a publisher who would then have it copied by many other specialist craftsmen such as engravers, woodcarvers and inkers. This meant that more technical specialization became possible, leading to much more complicated multiple layer and multiple color prints, which in turn further increased the demand. Hokusai would become quite famous in Japan, as well as abroad, for his work in the ukiyo-e style. His artworks were reproduced by the print houses and spread far across the country and further beyond. This was not the only factor in his success, though. In a fashion much more reminiscent of today's contemporary artists, Hokusai was supposedly a shameless self-promoter. In one famous case, he created an enormous painting of the Buddhist monk Daruma, which measured over 250 feet long, leading to much public praise. In another story, Hokusai was summoned before the emperor to participate in a competition with another artist to determine who was the more skilled painter. While his opponent set to work, Hokusai was supposed to have taken a huge sheet of paper and a large brush, He dashed a wide blue mark across the paper's surface and then produced a chicken. He dipped the chicken's feet in red paint and began to chase the chicken across the page. Upon completion of this task, he then declared his painting to be complete. It depicted, according to Hokusai, maple leaves on the river Tatsuta, a popular motif in Japanese art of the time. Impressed by his wit and, to be frank, his balls, the emperor declared Hokusai the winner. Regardless of his ever-increasing fame, Hokusai worked quite diligently throughout his long life. He was said to have risen early and worked late, constantly producing his work. He moved around quite a bit too, travelling across Japan, painting views of its landscape and making drawings of its people that would later become some of his most popular works. During this time, he made a living not only by selling his works, but also by teaching students. A quirk of Japanese artists, which makes keeping track of them a nightmare, is their penchant for taking new names. Hokusai, which was not his real name, was instead a shortened version of North Star Studio, a reference to his Buddhist beliefs and possibly a reference to the traditional preferred direction of studio life for painters, but I don't know, was an extreme case of this. He would regularly change his name, passing on the old one to students who were working in his style. This was not uncommon, but Hokusai, according to sources, is supposed to have done this anywhere from 30 to 100 times. Somehow, despite all of the confusion surrounding names, Hokusai's work became well enough known that he was regarded as a master in his own time. He continued working well into his old age, despite suffering a stroke at 60 which left him unable to paint, forcing him to reteach himself, shortly after which he was then struck by lightning. Not the best few months for Hokusai, but his bad luck wasn't quite over yet. On top of this misfortune, he also found himself saddled with the gambling debts of an unlucky grandchild. To cover these mounting debts and no doubt medical costs, collections of his work were published, including Hokusai Manga, a collection of sketches and drawings of Japanese people and places. This may be the origin of the current term manga for Japanese comic books, though in this case it has a much different meaning, roughly translating to random drawings or brush gone mad. Another collection produced during this time, which would prove to be his most seminal work, was 36 Views of Mount Fuji, a collection of views of, well, Mount Fuji. Hokusai travelled around and selected many views from the sacred mountain to centre his work on, and in doing so created some of the most striking images of Japanese art, as well as the most well-known and influential image of ukiyo-e artwork ever, the Great Wave off Kanagawa. The Great Wave is regarded as a masterpiece today. Its influence on subsequent artists and its constant referencing in artworks after its creation is a testament to the power of this simple image. It depicts a huge wave rising up over fishing boats which are dwarfed by its enormous scale. In the foreground, we see the waves lifting the boats and chopping the space into flowing mountains of water. Behind this, in the middle ground, we can see Mount Fuji framed by the swell of the wave. The huge mountain is made small by the overlapping perspective effects employed in ukiyo-e. The background consists of a light sky, which, when layered behind the wave, creates a yin-yang shaped composition, which adds an asymmetrical flow to the image, evoking the contrast between the sea and the mountain. Mount Fuji is a sacred mountain to the Japanese. In this image, however, it is presented as smaller than the wave, which represents nature and the turbulence of life. Fuji, in contrast, may be small, but it is also solid and constant. It evokes the spiritual in the face of these violent natural forces. Nature and spirituality are two of the key themes of Hokusai and many other Japanese artists' artworks. And these are themes that we'll be seeing explored in different ways again and again throughout the development of modern art. The boats depicted are traditional fishing boats that were known for their speed and used to quickly fish the turbulent waters off the Japanese coast. From the angle we see Fuji here, it paints a scene of boats returning from fishing grounds and being caught in stormy waters. According to the known dimensions of these traditional boats, it places the Great Wave itself as being around 10 meters tall. Not something I'd fancy witnessing from one of those boats, but great stuff for making striking art. In recent years, scientists have confirmed the existence of waves matching the size and ferocity of Hokusai's one. These rogue waves are a little understood phenomenon, but their existence points to the possibility that this wave was observed rather than just being an artistic creation. The Great Wave also has the distinction of utilising a then modern and cutting-edge material in the form of Prussian blue pigment. Prussian blue was developed in Germany in about 1706 and has the distinction of being one of the first synthetic pigments created by chemists in modern times. Until then, blues had been rare pigments which were used sparingly and often had issues of fading and impermanence. Prussian, or Paris blue as it was sometimes called, was one of the first mass-produced synthetic answers to this problem, and Hokusai uses it here to create the deep azure quality of the wave itself. It's interesting to note that Hokusai, who would inspire many Western artists with this work, was himself using Western-created materials, most likely imported by Dutch traders through Japan's strict custom laws. Hokusai was more open to Western thought than many of his countrymen and predecessors had been. This may well have contributed to his success in those countries. He was known not only to use imported materials like Prussian blue, but also to study Western painting manuals imported by those same Dutch traders. This can be seen in many of his works in the Views of Mount Fuji series, where he utilizes Western perspective techniques in addition to the traditional Japanese and Chinese versions. This cross-pollination of techniques may well have made his work more palatable to Western audiences, and possibly positioned him well for becoming the international influence that he did. Hokusai continued to produce work well into his old age, when he once again took a new name, Gacho Rojin, which roughly translates to old man crazy about drawing. I don't usually directly quote artists because those quotes can often be a bit soundbite-like, more suited to being refrigerator magnets or postcards than to telling you anything interesting about the artworks themselves. In this case, however, I will make an exception for the one well-known quote from Hokusai himself. From the age of 6, I had a mania for drawing the shape of things. When I was 50, I had published a universe of designs, but all I have done before the age of 70 is not worth bothering with. At 75, I'll have learned something of the patterns of nature, of animals, of plants, of trees, birds, fish, and insects. When I am 80, you will see real progress. At 90, I shall have cut my way deeply into the mystery of life itself. At 100, I shall be a marvelous artist. At 110, everything I create, a dot, a line, will jump to life as never before. Hokusai didn't quite make it to 110, but his remarks about a dot and a line jumping to life seem almost premonitory when we consider how art would change in the coming century after his time. Part of that change was caused by the art he and other Japanese artists made and the ideas it gave to a whole generation of artists half a world away, back at the centre of the universe of art, France. So next time, we will take a look at the work of an artist who was influenced by the works of Hokusai. A painter whose work also features a lot of natural and spiritual themes, as well as quite a few lively dots and lines. Next time, we will talk about Vincent van Gogh.